and you said, this is the sacred place where life begins. Can you talk a little bit more about how your people talk about this place?
Thank you, Senator. Our people think of this place as the heart. You know, we think of Ijik Watsan Kwantai Kodlit as the heart of the refuge. Okay, this is the heart of the refuge. And, you know, it was interesting earlier, our congressman talked about how it was just a little dot on his nose. And I thought that was funny because, you know, if I were to say to you, you want to do something about that dot on your nose, let's go ahead and have open heart surgery, you'd probably think, well, that's not a good idea, right? That's not a good idea. And so when we talk about the refuge, we talk about the land, it is tied to our language and our understanding of the world. And, you know, the Vadzai, the caribou, we are connected to them and we recognize that. You know, I hear this talk about development all the time. We need to develop this, we need to develop that. What I think we need is a little bit of understanding of the sustainability of the life that we live as Gwich'in. All right? We're not sitting here asking for anything. We're not saying we need hospitals, we need schools, we need all these things. We're not saying give us money. What we're saying is let us live as Gwich'in. Because we already recognize the wealth that we have as people. And it's nothing that you can give us. We recognize it's something that can be taken away from us. And so when we talk about the land, when we talk about the caribou, it's in reverence to them. And you know, I keep hearing, well, the locals, let's hear what the locals have to say about the 1002 area. You know what the locals are? They're caribou. Those are the locals that don't have a voice. And that's why we're here as Gwich'in.
One of the things that really struck me about that geography was how the Arctic plain where the caribou calf is the flat place. To the west is, frankly, an industrial zone. You can say you can say birds nest on every drilling rig, but it doesn't look like that when you're there. And then to the south and to the east are mountains. And this is the place where the caribou flow like a river, and this is the spring. And if you lose the spring, you lose the whole river, don't you?
Absolutely. And because, you know, I think there's this idea that with development, you know, you're only going to maybe harm part of the herd, or maybe they'll just move over a little bit. There's not that option for them. There's not that option. And so we're talking about the destruction of the herd and irreparable damage to our culture, to people that have been living there for tens of thousands of years. And when I say tens of thousands of years, I'm not just making up numbers. There's a place called Bluefish Cave in the Yukon Territory. It's the oldest known human campsite in North America, and that's Gwich'in territory.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to go back to this chart again because while it may be just effectively it's just an illustration, but having some experience with development in the Permian Basin and the San Juan Basin, having seen the development around Prudhoe Bay, I would just note for my colleagues that with at least the ungulates that I'm familiar with, like mule deer and antelope, it's not the well pads that typically are the substantial part of the disturbance and which can impede the movement of wildlife. It's everything that comes with those well pads. It's the roads, it's the gravel mines, it's the electrical transmission, it's the pipelines. And the more linear barriers you put in the face of any sort of migration, the less likely that migration is to occur. So rather than look at an illustration, I would just suggest maybe all of us or our staff can do a little Google Earth and go look at what Prudhoe Bay looks like, having flown over that, because it's not the well pads that got my attention, it's all those other linear obstacles to migration. I have a question for Ms. Epstein. You know, one of my frustrations with this process is that we're doing this through budget reconciliation. And in the context of a budget bill rather than a regular legislative process, and I assume we're doing that because it would be difficult, if not impossible, to pass this as standalone legislation and get 60 votes for it. But one of the requirements of that budget process is that we produce $1 billion of new revenue over the next 2 years. A new report out this week casts some serious doubt on whether that's realistic. Can you walk us through some numbers and talk about what would be necessary, in particular in terms of reasonable bonus bids, because that's the most likely income to come in the first 10 years, and whether or not we could hit that target or not, or what a realistic estimate might be?
Thank you, Senator Heinrich, and I would say that I share your frustration about the speed of this process and the inability to get all the information that decision makers need, the Senate needs to make a responsible decision. For just as an example, I have my colleague, a senior ecologist, has quite a number of responses to Dr. Cronin's testimony that I think would be very beneficial, and we will submit that to the committee, and that would be important so that you would have a full picture of the actual nature of the caribou development relationship as well as polar bears.
Be happy to add that to the record.
Yes, thank you. In terms of directly answering your question, I can partly answer. With the price of oil being what it is now, in the $50 a barrel range, Alaska is not terribly attractive in new areas to oil companies. And at the same time, we have lots of shale oil development in the lower 48 that is more inexpensive. So the idea that they would pay extra and go for bonus bids to be sure they had a piece of this very controversial area that a lot of companies would actually even shy away from is unlikely. I just participated in a National Academy of Sciences oil-related committee on Thursday and Friday, and I talked to some of my industry colleagues about the Arctic Refuge, and one comment I heard was that if this was likely to be as productive, you know, there would have been a lot more activity, more wells previously. So.
My calculations are that it would have to be a little over $1,300 an acre in terms of bonus bids, which is about 6 times the historical average. I don't have a ton of time left. I guess I'll just end with this. I guess we have to come up with $1 billion, but we produce a lot of oil and gas in the state of New Mexico. There are some places we will never, ever drill. The Valle Vidal, the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. I think we need to be careful about what doors we're opening today, because we will not be able to undo this once a substantial reserve is found. And to find that $1 billion, I would never advocate mining for uranium in the Grand Canyon or doing geothermal resources in Yellowstone. And having been to the refuge, it's a wildlife refuge. That's why it's called the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. It is not a petroleum reserve, and we should remember that.
Thank you, Senator.